Hi, I am Marco Castillo representing Global Exchange in our national mission here in Guatemala. We're here on the eve of next Sunday's high stakes presidential election. It pits Bernardo Arevalo, a candidate calling for fundamental systemic change, against Sandra Torres, a former First Lady, previous presidential candidate, and now the de facto candidate of system continuity. This evening, we're going to talk about it all. This live webcast is part of ongoing coverage. We will be going to Coban, Quetzaltenango, and Guatemala City, reporting back in these ways through election day and the final vote counting. Please make sure to follow us on our social media. Let me get started by introducing our very special guests for this evening. Megan Thomas, welcome. Megan is a political analyst, social science researcher, and a development worker in Guatemala. She participated in the Guatemalan Revolutionary Movement between 1970 and 1992 and is currently part of the FOCO Action Research Collective, working on generating information and analysis on and for social organizing in Guatemala. Welcome. And Vicky Gas, thank you very much. Welcome. Vicky is the Executive Director of LOG, the Latin America Working Group, an organization that has over 35 years working and advocating with the U.S. government on human rights issues and rights-based policy in the region. Welcome, Vicky. And let's get started with the questions. Megan, please, as an outsider who lives between Mexico and the U.S., what is happening in Guatemala right now seems a bit like a political fairy tale. Just last June, Bernardo Arevalo was a virtual unknown. He then wrote a hidden wave of support to a strong second place finish, qualifying for this Sunday's runoff. As soon as he qualified for the final ballot, conservatives launched a legal attack on Arevalo, electoral victory, and his party, but failed to derail his candidacy. Now, as I am arriving here to Guatemala this morning as part of this observation mission, the latest poll shows Arevalo leading by a wide margin. I'm talking about the Gallup CID poll. Is this a dream or is this really happening? Please help us understand.
Well, it's really happening, but it's also a dream, because the day before the general elections that took place on June 25th, none of us even thought of this scenario as something possible. And 24 hours later, Semilla, his political party, was in. And it's due to a lot of factors. I think as his original campaign manager said, they'll never see us coming. That was definitely a factor. I think there's a deep undercurrent in Guatemalan society, a progressive current for change, for dignity, for hope, for a better country. And this is something that Arevalo tapped. But he didn't come in a strong second place. He actually came in third because the first place was the void votes, null and blank votes, which is an active voter who actually went to the polls and did not choose anybody.
Right.
And that was an important factor that made his second place possible. I think the fragmentation of the vote on the right, there were 29 parties competing, 23 presidential candidates, and the bet on this divisiveness on the right was, getting a couple of people into Congress to be able to negotiate their vote. There were only 3 or 4 serious contenders. But that divided the vote, it fragmented the vote. So that's another factor that helped Arevalo get in. So in short, it is a dream, but it's also a reality.
But help us understanding the Arevalo name is unknown to most North Americans, but in Guatemala it resonates. Can you please help us understanding and briefly describing the legacy of Bernardo Arevalo's father, President Juan Jose Arevalo?
Well, Bernardo Arevalo's father was president from 1944 to 1951 as part of what is known as the Guatemalan Spring. Bernardo is using that term a lot. And it was probably the first democratic government in Guatemala's history, not just in this century. Education reform and really a lot of resources poured into education, the Social Security, the first labor code in the country. So, and these are legacies that still exist. The secondary schools that were built during his tenure are still there. And they're landmarks where they were built. So his name always resonated. The second government of that revolutionary period has a more conflicted legacy because President Arbenz tried to enact land reform. And even though that was a very important possibility for Guatemala and it was necessary, it was divisive. Whereas Arevalo's reforms were for everyone. It didn't have that part.
Interesting.
So even though this legacy is almost 80 years old, but as soon as the name came up, it resonated again.
Right. So you think that this history, Juan Jose Arevalo's history, it's a factor in this political sea change that we're witnessing in Guatemala?
Well, I would say it's definitely so. And not so much because people have learned about Guatemala's history in school, which is not the case.
Yeah.
But because families still tend to be pretty close-knit and you have multi-generational families.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as the Arevalo name came up again, in many, many families throughout the country, there were still generations that were familiar or had heard directly from their parents about this legacy.
Interesting. And do you think that there are any lessons for today's Guatemala's democratic from the revolution in the 1940s?
Well, I think the democratic revolution in Guatemala has an agenda that is still pending. A lot of the things that Juan Jose Arevalo did are still necessary. I mean, for one, political democracy is still totally necessary. I think we're in a totally different setting, and now a lot of these reforms have to reach the population in general, reach way beyond urban areas. And I think a good example of that is that Arevalo, one of his points in his government is that Social Security should be made available to all Guatemalans, including the families of Guatemalans who migrated to the US. And it's really taking his father's legacy and taking it quite a bit further. I think in education, he's making similar, though they have similar plans. So for women and girls, for those of us who were in the park last night,
Absolutely.
for the campaign closing act, when the vice presidential candidate, Karin Herrera, spoke of the future for young girls and said young girls should be scientists, they should be entrepreneurs, they should be doctors, they should be artists, they should be anything they want. And that got one of the loudest cheers from the crowd. So I think all of this legacy is just kind of coming into the 21st century.
Now, we want to understand what is the role of the U.S. with respect to the wishes of the people of Guatemala. So we want to ask Vicky, you are here as the new director of the Latin America Working Group, an organization with historic roots, and you personally of deep opposition to U.S. military and economic ties to dictatorships and repressive regimes and authoritarian practices throughout the hemisphere. And for decades, LOG has been a leader in calling out America's notorious practices and history of support for brutality in Guatemala. So, given all that history, I want to ask you, do you think that the US government will respect the wishes of Guatemala's electorate?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today.
Of course.
And we're just going to wait for that plane to go overhead because it makes it hard for everybody to hear. And it will pass quickly. It seems to be the hour of landing planes here in Guatemala.
Yeah. We've been here for hours and none of
this
them
is
have
now
passed.
it's the
So it's
time
happening.
for them to land. So your question is, will the United States respect the vote of the people on Sunday? And I would have to say, yes, I do think they will respect the vote. In fact, the United States and much of the international community spoke out very strongly after the first attempts to criminalize the Semilla Party and the attacks against the workers at the Supreme Electoral Tribunal. And even the US's representative to the OAS spoke very strongly about what was going on here in the country and mentioned the issues of the co-optation of state institutions, the fact that there's no independent judiciary, that it has been co-opted by mafias, that the government of Guatemala has to respect the will of the people. So I think they will continue in this line. I think the United States recognizes several things. I think one is there are many of us in Washington who have pressured our government to be more vocal about what was happening. We've been doing that since CICIG was pushed out in 2019, and we continue to alert them to what was happening here and push them to speak out. And I think they finally did when they realized what the government of Guatemala was doing after the 25th of June. I think we and my colleagues in Washington have our work cut out, as many people here in Guatemala do as well, is to continue to make sure the international eye is on Guatemala after the elections, so the will of the people continues to be respected, and that the Semilla Party isn't criminalized further, that there's no jailing of members of the electoral committee or of the Semilla Party or the tribunal, that they remain vigilant before the inauguration on January 14th.
How can our viewers and members of our organizations can help to make sure that the U.S. never again undermines Guatemala's democracy?
Well, that's a really good question. I think, first of all, what people in the United States need to do is look at the connections about what's happening here in Guatemala around growing authoritarianism and the threats we're facing in the United States, and realize that we're not dissimilar, number one. Number two, they have to continue to pressure their elected officials to speak out and speak in favor of the people of Guatemala's vote. You know, they have to continue that pressure, and it's not just a one-off. It's not one call. It has to be several calls. And they have to continue to support organizations that are working on anti-authoritarianism here in Guatemala and elsewhere, such as LOG and other of my colleagues. But this is not over on August 20th. It's going to continue for the next 6 months, and we need to be vigilant, all of us, and know that what's happening here can also happen there, and is happening to a large extent.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So we're live. We're here in Guatemala City, having a conversation with Megan Thomas and Vicky Gass from LOG, and we're talking about what's coming here. We learned and heard from Megan about the history of the candidate, the legacy of the Arevalo family in Guatemala, and the surprise for the international community to see this movement coming to become potentially the winning political option here in Guatemala, and also hearing from Vicky about the U.S.'s role and how can the U.S. Make sure that we the community in the United States can help supporting the people from Guatemala. But I want to ask both, and I'm going to lean back so that we want to have a conversation of three. What do you expect to see this Sunday?
Well, I think I kind of expect a civic celebration. That's
Nice.
what Bernardo Arevalo and Semilla have been calling for. And I think people have, well, there's now entire generations who have not experienced that, kind of since the peace accords.
Absolutely.
They have not experienced anything to celebrate having to do with politics. It's been, after June 25th and last night in the central square, running into friends and saying, boy, isn't it great to be here celebrating instead of protesting?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what we really expect, yeah.
I think in this mission that I've been part of, and I arrived here on Tuesday, and we've had several meetings with human rights organizations, lawyers groups, journalists, and just a whole host of people. And what we're hearing is that what the expectation is that the Semilla Party will win on Sunday. And I think the big question is by what margin? There are some who believe that he'll win by at least 30 or 40 percentage points, which today's polls actually bear witness that actually might happen. And there's others who think that it might be a much narrower margin. For the future of the country, it would be better for it to be a much larger margin, and it will be much better because part of the delegitimization and smearing of the Semilla Party has been to accuse it of fraud in collecting signatures, which apparently isn't unusual here in Guatemala, but also just to taint its image. And if it's a narrow margin, they can blow up that accusation even further and look at voiding some of the ballots, put legal challenges, and put serious obstacles in front of the Semilla Party being the winning force. If it's a larger margin, that narrative is changed. They can't do that because that is the will of the people. And that is democracy. And, the United States will come out and say, yeah, we support democracy, and other international governments will too.
Right.
How they define it is another issue. But, I think people will say that, a large margin, it's conclusive. The Semilla Party won.
Exciting.
Well, it is exciting, and you mentioned it last night. I was observing the activity in the plaza last night in the central square, and the emotions of people that you saw there was pretty phenomenal. And it was young, and it was intergenerational, and it was a lot of women and indigenous people, and that's great. And there's something that wasn't seen last night, which as somebody who has been involved in social movements for the last 30 years, is a lot of the normal, or well, you would see the usual banners from my colleagues of demands for land, demands for unions, demands for women's rights. You didn't see that. You saw the Guatemalan flag. You saw the Semilla flag. You saw flower pots with semillas, seeds coming out and flowers coming out. It was a different crowd. It was an organic and spontaneous movement, and that was phenomenal to see.
Amazing. And so, would you agree, Megan? I mean, what are the threats? I mean, we've heard from some of our colleagues that even beyond this Sunday, this is going to be an uphill battle. This government is going to find itself in the middle of a jungle where a lot of the institutions have been co-opted by corrupted uh, officials, and so it's not going to be easy.
No, it's not going to be easy at all. And just today, the Attorney General's office
Absolutely.
and the attorney in charge of the Samia case, which he shouldn't be, that's not his purview. But, he warned again that they're going to go after Samia, and he's doing this 3 days before the election.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue at stake here for a lot of these people in government and who have been in government, and a lot of the people who have kind of benefited from this corrupt regime, is impunity. I mean, they don't want to lose their immunity. Those who are elected officials and who are high-level officials have immunity from prosecution. But even others, they don't want to lose their privileges. They don't want to lose their access to government and to government contracts. They don't want to lose the freedom that organized crime has in the country now. So they're really going to fight tooth and nail
Absolutely.
against this. So everybody has warned about this long period, and it's a long period in Guatemala that was established 20 years ago so that there could be an orderly transmission of power. So they made it a longer period. It's 5 months. So for an elected government in a totally hostile environment, it's going to be a very rough fight.
And if even after they win the presidency, if they lose their registry as a political party, they wouldn't be able to take, for example, lead any commissions in Congress, right?
Right.
That's something that we heard.
right.
So they will still, lose some power if they lose the registry, even after the presidential election.
But as you were saying a minute ago, if it's a broad margin of victory, these officials that are going after Samia are going to have to think about it. That's, that is part of what would be at stake. Because Bernardo's already said that he's going to ask the Attorney General to resign. First thing, nobody really expects her to resign, but she's got a couple of years more. And once she's out with a Samia government. So they might have to hopefully tone down their,
Absolutely.
unless they're going to go for a coup scenario, for example. It's not clear that they would have the support of the military as a whole for something like that. So there's just a lot of unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I will also like to go back to something that you said, Vicky. I want to remind the public that when Trump was in power in the United States, is when the CICIG, the Commission, the International Commission Against Impunity, was pulled off Guatemala, and this allowed many of this corrupt powers to take over, and take back the power and empower themselves actually, and so what are the threats of a potential Trump presidency, for example, in the United States for Guatemala?
That's a horrifying question, I have to say. I just want to actually go back to what you said. I mean, for those in the audience who aren't aware, CICIG was an anti-corruption body that was founded in around 2006, 2007, and it grew to be the model for anti-corruption in Latin America and around the world. It was wildly successful in going after corrupt actors in both the private and the public sector. You had the resignation and jailing of the former president, Otto Perez Molina, his vice president, and other actors. And that was a wake-up call for what Megan said was those who are protecting their status quo. They realized that CICIG was a danger to them. And that's what started the push with heavy lobbying in the United States to get rid of CICIG in the country. So in 2019, Jimmy Morales, former president of Guatemala, did not renew its mandate. In 2017, if I remember correctly, and Megan can correct me, the head of CICIG, Ivan Velasquez, was made persona non grata en el país. And Trump supported it. You know, it wasn't just Trump, it was also the Republicans in the Congress. And so your question as to what happens if Trump isn't jailed for all of his arraignments and charges against him, and he is the Republican candidate and he wins, what happens? Well, it is a horrifying question, not only for Guatemala, because any support that might go towards a new government under a Semilla party would probably be taken away. Under Biden, there has been a decision because of the corruption and impunity not to support the government, not to support the Attorney General's office, but to only support local projects. My guess is that Trump would say, okay, well, we're going to go back to supporting the government, and that would just continue the flow of money coming here from my taxpayer money to supposed projects here in Guatemala that never get completed, but go into the hands of corrupt actors. And so the cycle would continue, and the misery would continue, and the poverty, and the lack of roads, and the schools that were built under Arevelo's father that are falling down now because they're in support will continue to fall down. And the roads that are being destroyed because of the weather and climate change will continue to be destroyed. And people will leave and they'll come to the United States and they'll try to enter the United States. And that's what we're looking at. That's the future. If we really want to help Guatemala, we need to stop this corruption and impunity in its path. We need to support the reconstruction of Guatemala and strengthen the democracy and civic participation. Otherwise, it's going to be horrible for Guatemalans. It's going to be horrible for everybody, just to be frank. I do have ideas about what the U.S. can do, which we can talk about when you're ready.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add another important fact. Last year, the U.S. gun makers shipped more than 12 million worth of weapons to Guatemala, which is nearly twice the previous years and close to 3 times the average gun exports of the last decade. And this is a result of also the Trump administration moving oversight of gun exports from the Department of State to the Department of Commerce. And then that is also something that definitely has impacted in violence in Guatemala. Unfortunately, just like many other countries in Latin America, U.S. guns are everywhere. Anything else that you want to add, Megan? And regarding of the role of the international community in helping succeed a potential Semilla government?
Well, I would just maybe backtrack just a little bit, and I think there's another factor in the unholy alliance of corruption and authoritarianism, which is the military who committed crimes against humanity and horrendous human rights violations during the war. And they became part of this unholy alliance because the trials, a justice system that had been modernized with professional judges and prosecutors, were able to prosecute many high-level military officials. So many of them were sitting in kind of white-collar jails with corrupt government officials. And I think that has helped to cement getting rid of CICIG
Absolutely.
But then now this kind of anti-Semia front. So I think, just taking into account what Vicky is saying about the US, I think the rest of the world will be supporting the Semilla government.
Oh, absolutely.
Latin America, democracy in Guatemala has a broad echo in Latin America because of its history. The overthrow of the Democratic Spring in '54 kind of was, a major factor in the Cuban revolutionaries taking up arms,
Absolutely.
and then the whole guerrilla revolutionary movements throughout Latin America of the '60s
Okay.
and '70s. And Guatemalan exiles have been all over the world. So there's support for democracy in this country. So I agree with Vicky that the greatest danger is in the U.S. if Trump would make a comeback.
I would like to think, just to add to what you're saying, and what we saw last night in the Central Square, and what we're seeing in the United States is the youth who are speaking up and saying we don't want this anymore, and we have to support them here, and we have to support them in the United States, whether it's around gun control and David Hogg, and or here the people are saying we don't want a right or a left, we want a new way that actually works for us and brings us food on the table and healthcare and education. That's what we want. And that's what people want in the United States, a decent life. I think we have to be realistic. Well, not realistic. I think we have to think about what happens, and we've made this mistake with Trump, actually, when we didn't actually think he would win, and he did, right? We didn't have a plan B. So what happens here in Guatemala if the polls got it wrong again, and Arevalo doesn't win, and Sandra Torres wins, and you have a continuation of the same suffocating mafia-type model? What is going to happen? What can be done? And that's where the international community has to come in. And that's where, for instance, from LOG's point of view, we will be looking at not only continuing to pressure our government to be vocal and publicly speaking out against the crimes that are happening in this country, but we will also be pushing them to increase sanctions against private sector actors and public sectors who are involved in the corruption, or who are the capital behind what's happening here. So there's the Engels list, which people say is más o menos effective, but or a badge of honor, depending on who you speak to. But there's also the global Magnitsky sanctions, which freezes assets, and the Engels list will prevent somebody from coming into the United States. Not a big deal, maybe, but Magnitsky is much stronger. So force that. But the third area that the United States has to look at is trade restrictions. Remember, it is the United States that is Guatemala's largest trading partner. And they don't want to do that because that hurts their own businesses. But if you really want to get behind the throne, who's behind the throne here? It's those who are doing the exporting to the United States, the big ag, and the United States will have to look at imposing some sort of trade restrictions and saying, look, you have got to let democracy flourish in Guatemala.
Yeah.
You have got to do that. Because the costs are too great. You can't have one hand stopping migration at Guatemala's borders and free trade with a corrupt government.
Right.
You cannot have both.
Right.
So that's going to be the big challenge.
Correct.
And it's one I've raised numerous times over the years. Maybe not as successful as I'd like, but they're listening more. And even President Biden said recently he questioned the model. So we got to expand on that a little.
So,
And I would just like to add on that just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Increased Guatemala's sugar quota.
Ay, Dios mío.
The sugarcane growers here, who are deeply involved in banking as well, are incredibly reactionary.
Absolutely. Ay, Dios mío.
So it was, there's no message. It's like there's a total disconnect between trade and economic policy and politics. That could have waited a few weeks, but it happened right during these highly polarized elections, right? So what was the message
What's the
there?
message? Yeah.
Is up for grabs, right? But I totally agree with Vicky. That's very important. And just to say that it's a running joke here now and has been for years. Poor thing, can't go to Disney once they get on the list.
Yeah.
Well,
because
yeah, it's a tough issue, that the sanctions and the Engels list. But for somebody who does advocacy in Washington and has to have a
it's
hook,
important.
it's important to have,
Totally.
and to be able to say this is a corrupt actor who
Totally.
has thwarted democracy, who has stolen U.S. tax dollars money, and they need to be sanctioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some
And-
people here. Oh, you go ahead.
Well, just to finish that, the mixed messages is true. I mean, the United States is particularly good at that. But shortly before or shortly after, I think the June 25th elections. Yes, it was after the 25th elections. The latest Engels list came out, where key figures were on that list, such as Freddie Oriana, who is the judge, who called for the raiding of Samia's office and the challenge to its legal status. And so sometimes they can be really right on target when they do things, but sometimes not. But we need to help them on that, and that's our role.
Yes, totally. I would just like to add that in the last decade or so, I think since the Obama government, the U.S. has been playing, at least in the human rights arena, the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala has played a significant role
Absolutely.
and has helped people who are being persecuted, has gathered information and really made it, got it to Washington. They've done many progressive things, and a lot of people in Guatemala still have a hard time coming to terms with that because of the U.S. role in '54 and then the U.S. role in the wars in Central America in the '70s and '80s.
Yeah.
People still have a hard time grappling with it, but I think it's important to recognize it, and that when the U.S. plays a more democratic and even progressive role, it makes a significant difference in the country.
Absolutely.
So it's very important.
Which is why we
Yes,
push
it
them
is.
to speak out.
Yes.
Right.
'Cause it does have a role.
We were talking with Vicky earlier today that it's also maybe the U.S. It's trying to figure it out how to deal with democracy in Mexico and Central America. Not really, right? The Biden administration is still trying to figure it out how to keep the business going, at the same time respect democracy, but at the same time trying to control migration. And we just need to continue to push for it to be coherent, because it cannot be like this. It cannot be encouraging businesses and free trade and at the same time,
Human rights.
yeah, exactly, limiting human rights. So yes, we want more of an active role of the U.S. in defending democracy and promoting human rights in the region.
Can I add to that? Because
course.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think another thing we have to recognize is we are no longer in the same economic era that we were 30, 40 years ago. Some of it continues, the extractive industries, whether it's agriculture or minerals. But it's a different world, and the tools that the U.S. has are different.
Yeah.
And who we're working with is different as well. And so we as a progressive community need to rethink and reflect on how do we act in this time? What is what are the advocacy tools? What's the language? What's the narrative? And we talked about this a little. It's a challenge in the United States. We don't often talk about the economic policies that have exploited people in my country, but also exploiting people here. Uh, Technology, the spyware that's happening in Mexico, for instance, in El Salvador. It's a new day, and we need to not throw the baby out with the bath water, as they say. We need to take what has worked in our work on human rights, but we also need to actualizarlo. We need to update it and think about this new world that we're dealing with and how to forge alliances and speak truth to power and bring about democracy and social justice, because that's why we all got into this thing, right?
We're talking
sorry.
to Vicky Gas from LOG and Megan Thomas from FOCO, and we're here in Guatemala, Guatemala City, as part of an international mission to observe and accompany the elections, this Sunday's elections. Vicky, do you want to share with the audience a little bit about the meetings that you've attended and some important takeaways?
Sure. I think I mentioned at the beginning, we've had a variety of meetings, and I think the objectives of these meetings were to really get a sense of different people, how they understood or analyzed the situation here in Guatemala, and what they saw as the opportunities and risks in the future. So as a electoral observer mission, we talked about, of course, what's expected on August 20th, and we talked about that here. And the groups that we met with are young journalists, independent journalists, and the threats that they face. Independent journalists are under threat because they don't have the protections of large networks like CNN or New York Times. So they're even more vulnerable, especially the women journalists. We have met with lawyers who could explain to us how the electoral system works here in Guatemala. So when we're doing our observing on Sunday, we will understand what we're looking at and where there are possibilities of fraud. And it seems quite little or minimal here in the country because of the model. We have met with human rights organizations who have raised concerns about how, because of this possibility of a change in government, how cases against military members, for instance, who were responsible for the assassination of Mirna Mack in 1990, are being shelved, cleared off. So if there is a Semilla party, they won't be able to come back and open those changes. They'll be closed, right? And these people will get away with murder, literally. We have met with different members of the international community to get their take. And we'll continue meeting with different groups from community organizers and women's groups and others. So
Interesting. Anything else, Megan? Final reflections?
Well, I think it's a great moment for Guatemala. A friend who's actually a journalist, now retired, but she said this is kind of like a collective subconscious that all of a sudden emerged. And I think it's a wonderful term. It's kind of hopes that underlie and that are quiet and are not expressed when people see no possibility for change. But as soon as they see the possibility for change, it just erupts. And
yeah,
like all the active volcanoes in Guatemala, right? And the seed image, which I never really cared for the name Semilla as a political party. But now when you see how people have really made it organic, right?
Right.
It's wonderful. So I think it's a really important time for people in Guatemala. There's hope again. Yeah.
Hope dies last.
Yes.
Thank you very much to both, and thanks to you all for watching us. Remember to follow us here on our social media, Facebook, YouTube, Global Exchange. We will continue to report as much as we can from Coban, from Quetzaltenango, and we will be here back on Monday with a post-election roundup and analysis.
Stay vigilant. Stay
Yes,
vigilant.
stay vigilant, exactly. Hasta pronto. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you both.